Out here, there are no conveniences.
It really is the last frontier. It's pretty easy to die out here.
We're all after the same thing. No limitations.
For years, Glen Villeneuve looked like a man destined only for the wild. Ever since the start of his show, Life Below Zero, he has lived a life that most men could barely imagine. And in the face of natural adversities, from wild animals to the biting cold, he devised new ways to survive in the Alaskan wild, thrilling some fans and leaving others genuinely afraid of his life.
I've always got a lot more to do than I have time to do. Not necessarily just work that has to be done, but things I want to see, things I want to learn about.
But in 2019, everything changed. Suddenly, he disappeared from the screens with no explanation. What exactly happened to him? Was this freedom suddenly too expensive? Join us as we discuss the heartbreaking tragedy that forced Glenn off the show. The Man Before the Wild. For most people, leaving the sweet scenery of the modern world to frolic in the biting cold of the wild is definitely not an option. Imagine a world without Wi-Fi, mobile phones, and skyscrapers. To most people, that probably feels like the beginning of the end. But not Glenn. Living in a place dead to any form of civilization is exactly where he bursts into life, like flames on a torch. As expected, fans had numerous questions, watching a man leave everything that made sense to the common mind, to venture into the unforgiving bites of the wild at nature's jaws. But to ever really understand the mind of a man who chose to leave civilization behind, it only makes sense to meet the man before the wild. Before his quest into the wild, he was just another American kid, trying to make his own way. At first, he followed the usual path, but it was always at the whim of his parents. They cracked the whip, and he just followed instructions. However, it didn't take long before they figured out he wasn't like every other kid. He never finished 4th grade or got a GED like most kids. He went to high school for a year, but that didn't stick either. For some reason, he leaned towards solitude as he grew older. So he learned to read, speak, and communicate with other people while homeschooling. However, neither he nor the parent could have predicted how quickly he started to enjoy being by himself. But it gets even weirder. At 13, he walked the length of Vermont by himself. How does anyone even talk a kid like that, out of a nomadic life in solitude? Although he had trod the path with caution, living in isolated places across the United States since he was old enough, with nothing but a rifle, a pot, and a place to sleep, in 1997, everything changed. In an interview on the legendary Joe Rogan show, Glenn revealed how much he reveled in living by himself in the wild. But the idea to really make a life out of living like a hunter-gatherer actually didn't really appeal to him until 1997. He was 28 years old at the time, living in the woods out in Vermont, in search of some sort of zen, away from the civilized world, and dispensing with everything he assumed he couldn't do without. According to him, he was having the time of his life. But he soon wanted more. So he packed up his things and headed for the one place every wildlife head in America goes: Alaska. And that was just the beginning of his reality in the wild. The life most people could never handle. It's one thing to be a stickler for solitude and choose to pitch a teepee somewhere in Vermont. But going to Alaska was always asking for trouble. Whether it was the large bear fishing at the lake or packs of wolves howling at the moon, it definitely wouldn't be the first choice as a home for most people. But Glenn was not most people. In fact, the blend of danger, biting cold, and a chance to fully unite with nature in its rawest form was the exact life he had always imagined. So he moved to the Brooks Range in Alaska. But the mountains of Alaska would be overwhelming for most people, and Glenn was no different. However, he had made a choice, and he needed to see it through. But looking at the depth of the woods he had been in, it wasn't hard to see why many wanted to know how he found the exact place he really wanted to be on the broad terrains of the Brooks Range of Alaska. That idea rarely came from a vacuum. While he was living alone in the woods in Vermont, dreaming of a different life, he flew over the bush plains of Alaska, thinking he could actually become a bush pilot. Perhaps it wasn't the common type of dream for most people, but Glenn was different in a lot of ways. During one of his flights, he found the perfect spot in the Brooks Range of Alaska and dreamt of going there ever since, with no real plan on how to survive, other than figuring it out as he went. Maybe the hopelessness and lack of a clear plan might have been enough to stop anyone else. Not good old Glenn. He loved a challenge, especially if solitude was the prize. At first, it wasn't the easiest of challenges. In fact, when he fully moved to Alaska in 1999, it took him 7 years of planning. First, he lived in Fairbanks for 4 years before finally getting the hang of living in the wilderness all by himself in the Brooks Range of Alaska. But as Marcus Aurelius said, the hardest prison to escape is the comfort that made you weak. Glenn was dying for a chance to lose the comfort and create a new way of survival. While he did try to be as far away from the modern world as possible, he caught the attention of the media. It was the perfect idea for a television show. A mountain man living in the Brooks Range of Alaska, hunting his own food and making tents out of caribou hides. What could top that? But how exactly did he react to being on the show? And did it really work out? Becoming the face of the wilderness. Finally living a dream in almost the exact way it was planned isn't exactly something everyone could brag about. But for Glenn, he absolutely could. He was living the exact way he had imagined, making meat poles out of parachute cords, and even being the mean big brother sometimes, stealing a kill from a wolf pack. But just when he never truly imagined it could get any better, the BBC came calling. While it appeared he had actually formed this solo pact with nature, he was not entirely all by himself in the wilderness. As a fact, other people shared his mindset, including Sue Aikens, who lived alone on the Kavik River in the Arctic Circle, Chip and Agnes Hailstone, who lived with their 7 children on the Kobuk River in Norvik, Jesse Holmes, who lived in Burj Khana, and Andrew Basich, who championed the Yukon River, Eric and Martha May Salitan, and Rico DeWild. Together, they were a solid team of people with vast experiences in how to live alone in the wilderness. But when the BBC came for Glenn, it was almost out of the blue, but he had indeed played his own part in it. Months into his progress in the wild, he discovered that the solitary life as a hunter-gatherer living in the mountains during winter and surviving on moose and building tents out of animal hide was not exactly normal or easy. It was no mean feat, and he knew it too. So every time he came to town, he inquired about making a documentary where he could simply talk about nature now and then and document his own experiences with it. He could rarely find anyone with know-how. Perhaps it was largely because he rarely had that many friends or human interaction anyway. However, he finally decided to take a bold step. He sent out an email when he left the wild for a while and asked that Hollywood reach out to him to talk about a show. And right as rain, some Hollywood big shot flew in from Los Angeles and poked him for more answers. They tried to see if he really was surviving off moose and caribou, as he suggested in the few conversations they had with him. Of course, all it took for the Hollywood rep was just a one-on-one conversation with him, and he knew they had struck television gold. And just like the same man who fled public eyes was back in it. only this time on television. Talk about the wheels coming full circle. And just like that, National Geographic rolled in the cameras on May 19th, 2013. But for a man who always loved his own space, how did he deal with the cameras and the pressure that came with it? The cost of living the dream. Unlike most people, Glenn was not really searching for fame on television. To him, this was an avenue to tell his story, with others like him also getting the shot to do the same thing. But according to the man, he had never seen reality shows before. He had stopped watching television for a long time, so he rarely had any real idea of just how big the show gets and how famous he could really be. Although it was the first time their show was ever being aired, America had seen its fair share of survival reality shows. Spoiled for choice with shows like Survivor, Survivorman, and Man vs. Wild. Life Below Zero was obviously facing some seriously steep competition, but the BBC and National Geographic took a wild chance on their mountain man, Glenn, and the other cast members, including notable names like Sui Aikens and Agnes. When they released the very first episode, the show was wildly accepted. To most fans of survival reality television, it was almost a breath of fresh air, taking them away from the constant loop of Survivorman and Man vs. Wild. And Glenn was an important piece of that puzzle. He got just as much screen time as Sue and Rico. He was the subsistence hunter who kept the soul of the show alive. Whether it was skinning a moose or taking down wolves, he willingly got his hands dirty, bonding with nature for entertainment. With an initial rating just points below 8 out of 10, the show seemed almost impossible to ever fall off the rails. Not like it hadn't happened to the other shows, but fans' reception kept growing, and the popularity spread like wildfire. While Glenn really did find fame, he was indeed looking for a platform to show what he does. Yet, it was a far cry from the life that he was originally used to. At first, some fans considered him the only one of the cast members who seemed least likely to be torched by the flames of success. But that wasn't really the case, was it? Although it wasn't really the first time Hollywood's very best had come crashing down under the pressure to deliver, can that really happen to a mountain man whose life had been enshrined in solitude forever? However, success does have a way of flipping a switch and changing everything. Obviously, he had to make more sacrifices in terms of hours of work. It was no longer simply spontaneous. There were filming plans and locations to shoot from, meaning that he spent a lot more time working with more people in a day than he had spoken to since he moved to Alaska in 1999. But while fans enjoyed the rifle hunting and survival skills in the wild, especially during winter, there are things in his life that the cameras failed to capture. He was fighting personal battles that couldn't be won by sheer determination, survival skills, or a rifle. Just how did he survive that? Paid in full. Since the start of the show, he has made numerous sacrifices, as every good thing requires. Perhaps the sacrifices were barely in places he would have preferred them to occur. But his choices started to thin out when he made that appearance on the cameras in 2013. For context, fans had often wondered about his private life, but for some reason, he had constantly avoided stating the names of his parents or other relatives, leaving fans with more questions than answers. Why did he really leave the city for the wilderness in the first place? And did he have a life outside the hunt? Before his first full flight into the wild, he was married to Sylvia. According to him, he was able to actually convince her to move into the wild with him now and then. And they stepped out for a life among people whenever she just wasn't having it anymore. According to his account, she was just an amazing woman to take to the bush. But just a few years before the showrunners came looking for him, his marriage with Sylvia ended. While he barely attempted to tell the reason she just left, his silence spoke volumes, and critics had theories that would make any head spin. Glenn revealed that he often went into the wild sometimes, all by himself, bonding with nature for months and leaving Sylvia on land by herself. For reference, he claimed that he hadn't spoken to anyone in 4 months before the Hollywood bigwigs found him for a one-on-one interview. Perhaps Sylvia felt the same loneliness being married to a man so engrossed in solitude. It took too much to yank him from it. Could anyone realistically live with that? Tormented by his dreams, and now by fame, just how long could he truly survive? But the price for fame was always steep, and he knew it too. So he took it in his stride and ran with the show for as long as he could. But in 2019, everything changed. In 2019, Glenn parted ways with life below zero. At first, it started with less screen time on his storyline, and Sue Akins and other cast members suddenly had even more screen time than they usually did. Fans caught the signs, but it was too late. Although the show had ended for him, it was still the same old Glenn, still living in the mountains and definitely popular with the viewers. Speaking of popularity with the viewers, avid fans of his subsistence lifestyle and survival instincts asked questions about his departure. Obviously, the network remained tight-lipped, completely unwilling to explain why they parted ways with a fan favorite like Glenn. As expected, some critics suggested that only Glenn and the network really had the answers to his departure, but both parties remained unwilling to give up any information, leaving question marks on Glenn's true legacy as a television survivalist. What exactly does Hollywood make of his legacy, and how has he defined it? The heartbreaking legacy of Glen Villeneuve. It is impossible to talk about life below zero without Glenn. He was a huge part of the subsistence living and was known for handing out tips on how to survive in the wild. The show was nominated for 2 Emmy Awards between 2015 and 2017, meaning critical acclaim wasn't even too far away from his grasp. But the clouds that shrouded his mysterious disappearance from the show needed to be dispelled. And in 2020 on The Joe Rogan Show, he finally spilled the beans. He claimed that his contract had been renewed, and he was invited for 1 episode. But right after, the network stopped calling him, indirectly telling him to leave with no explanation. And just like that, his legacy went from impervious mountain man to pitiable, especially since he claimed he had been wrongfully treated. But that was only the beginning of his heartbreaking legacy after the show. While his futile struggle to keep Sylvia was no secret, getting married to Tricia, who was an attorney in Boston at the time, seemed to add some wind back in his sails. However, in July 2023, he revealed on his Instagram that Tricia had left him, taking her daughter, Amelia, with her, and leaving him with their daughter, Agatha, who was 5 at the time. Fans started to connect the pieces of the jigsaw, and the bigger picture definitely wasn't pretty for Glenn. "There goes the second wife" was a common reaction to his message. Perhaps that was his biggest flaw. He got so committed to the life of solitude that he let the real world pass him by, losing partners after partner. Suddenly, he was no longer just Glenn the survivalist. His legacy was viewed from the blurred lens of a man lost to the wilderness with no way out. But while he licked his wounds in solitude and struggled to figure out the life of single fatherhood, he was yet again on the cusp of a new loss, perhaps even more dangerous than everything he had once survived. But what exactly could that be? His whole life had been the perfect ruse. He did his job, but mostly kept his family's name away from the media. But sometimes, fatal losses have ways to loosen the tightest lips. Glenn lost his mother to dementia just 3 weeks to the day that he lost Tricia. Hit by a freight train of losses, Long-term fans saw a man who had once survived the biting cold of Alaska, the grizzly bears, and living on caribou meat, dwindling under heavy burdens of loss after a career blessed and cursed by solitude in equal measure. Perhaps this was always his legacy. Not the man who conquered nature, but the type who figured out that life's real battles were fought within. Do you think Glenn incurred these many losses because he chose nature over everything? Is there a chance that Glenn creates his own survivalist show? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.